What if the real story of this moment isn't about models or automation, but about productivity, adaptability, and people? Welcome back to Let's Take a Walk, brought to you by the Feld Group Institute. Today, Charlie is joined by Ken Spangler, longtime friend and former FedEx executive who spent decades running technology and operations at a truly global scale. Ken has lived at the intersection of IT and operations, and now, in the AI era, he's asking a different question. What does this moment mean for how work actually gets done? And what does it mean for the humans inside the system? Now here's Charlie.
Hey, today I've really been excited and looking forward to sitting down with Ken Spangler. Ken's been a friend for 25 years. It's amazing how fast it's gone. But I met Ken at FedEx, and over his 25 years there, he ended up running the entire global application and infrastructure for all of the FedEx operation, which you can imagine how complex that is. And Ken's got a reputation and a kind of a resume that is very focused on engineering, architecture, frameworks. He's kind of a developer's CIO, if you will. And you can imagine the scale of a FedEx, the number of packages at $90 billion a year. Ken retired about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and has really thrown himself heavily into the AI space. During his years at FedEx, he was very involved at Carnegie Mellon and has been teaching there and learning from that because his role has been from Pittsburgh. And since he's retired, which is not really retired, he's on a couple of AI boards and has done a lot of speaking and research into AI. So it's kind of a unicorn conversation that I want to have with Ken today, which is very much about AI in the corporate setting, where the AI at the edge and the AI at the center is got to go through a tremendously complex set of processing transactions and data. And that's one piece that I want to talk about is what does he see from his vantage point, having lived in both worlds. And the second part I want to talk to Ken about is really what does it mean for people? What does it mean for the workforce? What does it mean for productivity and growth? And that's really where I think he's seeing the world from a different perspective than most operating CIOs or most engineering agentic AI people. He's seeing at the intersection of those things. What does it mean to the workforce? So Ken, let's start out with talking about a little bit about your background and how you got so into the AI space over the last couple of years.
Well, Charlie, let me start with thank you for having me. Charlie, for everybody that's on here, I'm sure they know Charlie. Charlie's one of my, not just good friends, but one of my heroes in life. And getting to collaborate with and work with and even get coached from Charlie through all these years is one of the great honors of my life. And so if you talk about my background, I just had a blessed background. I was lucky. I started a software engineer, and in early days was building things like automated package sortation systems and the data flows that make that happen. And so, from the very, very beginning, I thought of things like massive transactions, the levels of scale and redundancy that are unique. And then, just had a career where I was blessed that we were always innovating. We were always pushing the edge. And that's kind of relevant to why there's so much interest in AI today. But I spent almost 34 years, about 33 and 3/4 years with FedEx, and blessed career all the way through. Fred Smith, and recently passed this year, sadly. It's just incredible to be around because he's a true, while he ran one of the world's most complex business, what I realized is he was always the innovator. I mean, that's who he was. He was innovating and always the entrepreneur. And so just seeing and experience that and getting to be exposed to that was amazing. And then, one of my, mentors and now great friends and has been friends for years is Rob Carter, the legendary, CIO at FedEx. So blessed career, almost 34 years. Scale and automation and innovation was just in our DNA. And that I loved every minute of it. Now, I made a kind of life plan truly when I was 36 years old, actually, about, I wanted to retire before I was 60, so I was young enough to do other things. And doing other things, I never knew what that was called. People tell me now it's called your portfolio career. So I've just learned that term in the last year and a half. But as you said, I'm doing some board work, board of directors of a really fun AI company, doing some private equity advising, and I'm doing some, strategic executive consulting at some kind of really big enterprises, in fact, one bigger than FedEx. So it's, I'm kind of getting exposed to a lot still. However, go to the core, the main point of today, and that is, if you think about my career, and I guess the part I left out is, at a company like FedEx with 600,000 people, it's hard to be unique. Everybody, we're one of a massive team, and that was the best part of it. But the one thing that made me unique at one time or another, I was the CIO of each of the operating companies. And ultimately, the most of the last decade when I retired, I was executive vice president of global operations technologies. So in my career was one of those where IT meets OT, the true traditional information technology at massive scale and the incredible operations technology that makes amazing things happen. I lived at the intersection most of my career. And what I love about that today is I could equally say where IT meets OT, the collective two of those meet AI. And that's really the era we're in. And I also like to, if I think about it that way, and why is that so important? You know, AI is really not about the technology. AI is about value. It's about getting value for businesses. And in order to get value, again, what's the focus to get value? Organizations and individuals have to major in change. And if you're going to major in change, that means this is the most adaptive era. We have to adapt. We have to get more comfortable with change. But what I would say is, we has to be systematic about how we adapt. And so, that's where I think I'm kind of setting up your part about, we're going to talk about
Mhm.
AI and what's valuable about AI, but the human element and the human element of change is, I mean, you set it up perfectly, Charlie, is
Mhm.
one of the most important parts when you
Mhm.
talk about AI.
Yeah, I think if you look at the agrarian era going to the industrial era, it was a big change. People were coming off the farms, going into the factories, but it happened over decades. And the education systems and the workforce was able to adapt to it because of the number of years that it took to happen. This has happened like boom, right? It's just like overnight, and it really hasn't been overnight as we look at it through the technology lens and Moore's law and Metcalfe's law. We saw it coming, but it really is accelerated because of Moore's law and because the technology is so spectacular and the ability for people to adjust, the education systems to adjust, the value systems to adjust is pretty scary to folks. And I think that you can't be afraid of change because if you don't like change, you're going to hate extinction, right? As a country, as a company, as an individual.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, just kind of playing on that, a couple things that are really important. We already talked about the AI era being about change, but I think it's doing a lot of things. I mean, one of the things and this is not my quote. This is a quote of where I heard this from guy Dave Kops. He's the CEO of Worlds, a great AI company, super smart, really good friend. We collaborate a lot. Sometimes we just get on the phone and just brainstorm things. And he works with a lot of universities, even high schools. He wants people to think in the AI era. And he simplified something in just, a 1 to 2 sentence thing. And he says, we've always known knowledge is power. The education that the and success was directly correlated to knowledge. He said it's not about that anymore. He said it's about what you do with knowledge is power. And that's,
Mhm.
if you think about that, it's really true. And so, we're in this, this time that, as you kind of set that up, there's a lot of fear and fatigue around AI, I would say. And one of the things I do, I guess I get to speak quite a bit still. And one of the things I talk about for leaders is, that the, when you talk about AI, in fact, this is kind of a little controversial story, but I was presenting somewhere and I was the third presenter, and the first two presenters said, "I promise this is an AI-free zone. We're not going to talk about AI." And I was a little bit controversial when I got up because I said, "I promise you are going to talk about AI." I says, and I think it's incredibly important to talk about AI. More importantly, it's incredibly important to avoid the fear and fatigue because, as you said, the pace of change, speed of change has always been increasing, right? It's the speed and the scale, it's the exponential equation of speed and scale of change that's really fatiguing people. And so I really started that day, and since then I've started to use just one example, and I just talk about, the economies around the world, something as simple as GDP growth, right? If you're business school 101 and you just think about, fundamentally at the root, what causes GDP growth, it's really, workforce participation, aka directly correlated to population, right? And it's
Mhm.
productivity. And that has driven, economies, and the US being the greatest example in the world of just, both population growth and productivity have driven great GDP growth and the largest economy in the world. However, the one thing we know for certain is that populations, especially around the industrialized world, are all below replacement levels for the first time. As the world's gotten more educated and more urbanized, there's just less, children, and it's just a fact. I mean, if you need
Mhm.
2.1 to have replacement, many places, the industrialized world is running 1.0 to 1.3 to 1.4. And so if you're really going to have a declining, base population over a long period of time, right? And you need that as far as workforce participation, then the only way to have true GDP growth, if one of these two pillars is not growing, is to have massive productivity, right?
Mhm.
And so I view AI, I replace the words fear and fatigue with necessity and opportunity. I think it's
Mhm.
the greatest opportunity at the greatest time because it's going to drive levels of productivity. Second,
Mhm.
really macro point I'd add to that is, and again, when I speak publicly, I'm just using this example, is that there's you have to get levels of productivity, and then everybody also has part of the fear of fatigue is it's going to replace all these jobs, and certainly it's going to replace and eliminate some jobs, but right now AI isn't really replacing jobs, it's augmenting jobs. Okay,
Mhm.
it's not replacing the human, it's making the human have a form of a superpower.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing. There's, again, 2 points on this is, one, it's augmenting and making people much more productive, and we need productivity. But also, really, really big, point here is we've seen some of the things that AI can do that do replace jobs, and that's been going on since the Luddites and the looms, right?
Mhm.
But what we're not seeing yet is the jobs are going to be created. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you get into things like true, and the generic term we'd use in the past would be governance. But when you get into the true parts of that have to do with, compliance and trust and assurance, and there's a whole bunch of jobs in the AI space that just haven't been realized yet that will be a necessity. So
Yeah.
I talked a lot there, but I mean, GDP growth needs massive productivity. AI is a revolutionary opportunity to have massive productivity. Yes, it'll replace some jobs, but I believe it'll create as many jobs. And the other thing is, it's the ability to just make humans more productive, not replace humans, is the era we're in now, at least.
Yeah, I think if I look through the lens of my career, working with different industries. I think it's going to hit different industries in different ways. So, we're working with a hospital system now that, there just aren't enough doctors and nurses and, to cover the waterfront as the population ages, and we become much better because of AI and some of the other tools that people have to cure more diseases, to detect more diseases, to get better imaging systems. And, you know, but the cost and the limitation of professionals and the things that, if there's a way to make doctors and nurses and, people that work in the hospital system more productive and efficient, we can take care of more people,
Hmm.
right? And reduce the cost and the wait time of healthcare, and, make it so it hits different industries in different ways. The thing that is difficult as I talk to groups of people is, what about me? What should I be doing now, right? If I'm working as a FedEx courier, if I'm maybe nothing, right? If I'm working maybe nothing. In other areas, though, we're reshoring a lot of manufacturing jobs now, but there's going to be a lot of AI and a lot of edge technology making cars,
Okay.
right? And making chips. And so, how do you begin to think about careers, and how do you begin to think about what should I be learning as I go forward, right? In different places, in
You know,
different
it's
industries.
a great question, Charlie. And I think the first thing I would say is, and I don't want to just keep pounding the theme of adaptability, but you know, there's been a saying, right? As long as we've been humans, humans by nature, we're just by nature, all of us are resistant to change. We're comfortable with what we're comfortable with. And, obviously the world changes faster and faster, but it's truly a skill that we have to focus on, not a passive thing, an active thing, is
Mhm.
creating adaptability. Okay.
Right.
Organizations, leaders must enable and empower and challenge their organizations to be more adaptive. Okay. And every one of us as humans have to be more adaptive. Now, I'm an eternal optimist. I get to do a lot with Carnegie Mellon University, one of the great universities in the world. And, one of the things, even before I was doing the adjunct professor role, I was for like 12 years, I was a guest lecturer multiple times a year. And, I used to come home all the time and, tell my wife, I'd say, everybody always wants to say, oh, this next generation is not as good for this reason, that reason. In my entire life, I've never seen that. Each generation gets greater. Okay.
Mhm.
And I would notice as I was doing these every year, just the types of questions I would get asked were better. And they
Mhm.
were better for a bunch of reasons, but one is this was a grown-up digital generation. The information they had at their fingertips was so incredibly powerful that they were learning broader things. So when I would get questions, the questions were much more global. They were much more broad. They were thinking in integrated terms of the whole world works together. And that used to impress me to no end. So I see it right now. And I think that, each generation is more adaptable, but all of us have to be adaptable. And then you say why that is. And I'm going to kind of draw a parallel. This is a little bit controversial as well because I've worked with the whole consulting third party space is companies I've worked with my whole career, and they provide incredible value and they're big companies. But I think the whole the future of consulting, especially IT consulting, that business consulting thing, really changes as much as anywhere. And I think
Mhm.
some of it is just simple. If I was kind of simplifying it down to two things, I would say it's really not going to be about working with companies to develop technology anymore. It's about working with companies to merging with technology. It's
Mhm.
about utilizing it, not as much developing it as is utilizing and benefiting from it. And then the
Right.
second tier is it's what we're talking about here. The organizational adaptability. In the old days, we'd talk about OCM, organizational change management. We're putting new systems in, we're making changes. That is
Mhm.
just going to be systematic. So sorry for the long answer, Charlie, but I think
No, no,
whether
no,
you're a
no.
courier and you're utilizing technology in way different ways that augments your productivity, or you're in medical field, or you're a student today, it's the opportunity is to be much more adaptable. but it's because we're merged with technology to significantly enhance productivity.
Yeah, and I think that, if you think about our framework, which everybody on the community call knows what it is. I mean, it's the harmonization of the business architecture with the technology architecture, which is going to change massively, but then it's got to lead to an economic equation. So the economic model has got to create value in a different way, but the organization has got to change as you go. So you've got to be able to move those pieces at the same time. You can't get so far ahead with the technology and not get value out of it, which is a little bit of what's happening now, right? But that'll catch up. But the long pole in the tent continues to feel like the organization, right? The structure, the workforce, not so much the IT workforce, but we're moving so rapidly that let's not talk about the college kids and the kids that are coming up. Let's talk about the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old that has done a job and hired to do a job, and now agentic AI is replacing the call centers and replacing, how do companies begin to think about the organization component of the framework and moving it with it? Because if one's behind, you're going to get a lot of resistance in the change.
It's funny, Charlie, as you were going, I wrote a couple notes because there's a couple things that are huge. First of all, let me show a little appreciation here. Your models, how many times have I said, Charlie, the brilliance of your models is how durable they are. I know when you first created them, you were creating them at a time that says, we created value for 20 years as a Feld group, and we want to have that IP documented. But the
Right.
reality of it is, the magic is those models are incredibly durable. And you know how much I was a student of them, and
Right.
drove in my leadership roles. We utilized them in massive degrees. And so I think anybody on here, that knows these models, it's important to think about and recognize how durable they are because they still apply.
Mhm.
Related to this, I think, getting into the root of your question is, one of the things we said already, AI is not about the technology, it's about value. And
Mhm.
where companies are getting value or not getting value strictly has to do with, are you just trying to apply AI to the way you already work?
Right.
Or are you looking at it and say, we could work differently? And to me, in everything I've run into so far, that is clearly the differentiator of those who are just really busy and active doing a bunch of AI things and getting limited value versus those who sometimes are doing less but getting a lot more value. They're not they're not hostage to, well, this is the way we've always done it, so how can we apply
Mhm.
AI to it? I just proofread a book for somebody who's writing a great book on what AI means and change and adaptability. And I feel terrible because I can't remember the name of the book. But anyways, and it's not out yet. I was just proofreading and kind of
Right.
helping provide some input. But they talked about the hyper adaptability, and they
Mhm.
talk about we're in the era of hyper adaptability that everybody has to be comfortable with change. So now back to your question is, the companies that really are thinking about this right. Well, I'm gonna say it real simple. Business is never about doing the same.
Mhm.
Business success is about doing more. Now, maybe I had a bird's eye view to that because Fred Smith was the ultimate. We're going to do more. We're going to innovate. We're going to think differently. And even as late in my career when he had led one of the world's great companies for 50 years, and he was still every day coming up with ideas and trying to innovate. But that's what business is. It's about doing more. And so
Mhm.
this is the greatest opportunity to do more. So what I think is, there's a lot of things that are going to be augmented. Call center is a really good example. The disruption there is real, okay? But there's a higher level of capability and service that humans still need to provide. There's a level of domain expertise is required more than ever now to create not just the models and enhance the models. We always think of large language models. We don't think about small language models or domain specific, micro models. But that's the real world of the future. Okay.
Mhm.
The accuracy and the capabilities are going to be done by that. So that level of domain expertise should just do higher level jobs.
Yeah,
I think that's an important thing to think about. What
yeah,
else does my skill set, my knowledge contribute to, and or how do I adapt to contribute at a different level?
yeah. I've been writing about and thinking about and talking about the role of IT in an IT/OT world, right? And the role of the CIO can't be the same because we can't do everything. Everything can't come in as a project and get stacked up, and we'll get to it eventually. That there's going to be a lot of edge and innovation coming in, and it's going to become part of everybody's job. Call center people coming up with these things. And the role that I've really pushed hard on for at least 15 years has been the CIO role, not as a chief information officer, but the chief integration officer.
Mhm.
Somehow we need to build the integration data, digital nervous system, so people can be creative at the edges and plug in instead of making it an IT project. And I know your son is working at a bank and he's doing development, right? He wasn't trained as a developer, and that stuff is pretty valuable coming in from the people that are the end users, like a call center person coming up with an idea to improve service and then plugging into a digital nervous system.
Yeah, I mean, my son started his career in a bank, and he's transitioned a little bit. He's a perfect example where he's a software engineer and solutions architect, and doing AI and automation work. And early on, some of the AI tools that we're using, and again, from he's doing design to implementation, so he sees the whole life cycle. And he originally said, these tools are incredible, and they make me 30% more productive. And then
Mhm.
less than a year later, he was like, yeah, in true quantitative, we're 100% more productive. And
Mhm.
now he's like, we're 300% more productive. Not only three, he said, and I develop in languages I didn't develop in before
Right.
because, again, the human is augmented and his productivity and his teammates' productivity skyrockets. And then the other thing is, not a manager, right? He's an individual contributor doing really, really sophisticated things. And he says, with things like Crew AI, you develop, agent workforces that can do work. And sometimes you can create agent workforces to do the work two different ways and see which one accelerates, the way we work and how we want to change even better. So, I mean, that's just, that I think it's the perfect example. Everybody says in the software engineering space, oh, there won't be room for software engineers. Well, I don't know. I mean, last I checked, every IT group I've ever met anywhere in the world had more work than they could ever begin to get to. And prioritization and limitations were the thing we all knew. Well, what about we take that population and we accelerate their productivity and we can deliver so much more? That's the era we're in. Okay.
Yeah.
To your main
But,
point though, let me get back to
mhm.
it. This is, I said controversial twice. Let me say going to replace controversial with intellectually provocative. Let's be intellectually provocative, right?
Right.
One of the things is, I do believe this. I was the CIO role has been around for decades. It's still one of the most important roles in business. It's the youngest, as you like to say. Maybe not even still fully understood yet. But I believe this merging of chief information and integration officer, which Charlie used. First time I heard you say that was 20 years ago, and I thought that's
Mhm.
brilliant. And I think it's more true today than it was then. But I do think this whole digital, and I think, we've been in the digital era, but I think we're changing to the digital AI era right in front of us right now. And I think the new, more modern roles is the CIDO in a lot of cases, Chief Information Digital Officer, some call it Chief Digital, and whatever. I mean, there's a million titles out there. But here's the way I've been starting to say it is, the CIO, why it was so important and incredible is it was the enabler, the technology enabler, the change enabler in the enterprise technology era. Okay.
Right.
But when I think of a CIDO, I think of it It's the transformer in the digital AI era. And oh, by the way, they're still the enablers. So
Mhm.
it's not a replacement, it's an addition too. These roles have gotten even more important. And
Mhm.
and I think at the heart of it is I realized some years ago it was a definition of digital problem. When
Right.
we all, especially the company like FedEx, I got called about jobs all the time. I guess people eventually figured out he's never going to leave FedEx. He loves it there. And that was true. But when I would get called about chief digital officer positions, I started to have this practice. I would ask the, executive recruiter, I'd say, well, what's their definition of a chief digital officer? And
Mhm.
in the early days, it was always, digital experience or digital access. It was about your websites, your mobile devices and connectivity and stuff. But over time, more and more, it became digital enterprise or digital transformation. These were truly
Mhm.
they became transformer roles. We want to be a digital enterprise. We need a chief digital officer. I think that redundancy is chaotic. And I
Mhm.
think the modern era is the chief information and digital officer. And what are they? This is recognition that these are larger, expanding roles in an expanding era. And it's from the evolution of the enterprise era to the revolution of the AI era that they're
Right.
super important positions.
Right.
So
But,
whatever the
but,
title is, it's that integration you're talking about. This is just an
right.
example. Integrator as the enabler and the transformer is super important.
But don't you believe that there's going to be, let's just call it citizen development, non-IT people doing innovative things at the edges and changing the way their departments and their functions work? And how do you begin to think about work that's going on at the edge that is not being done by IT, yet is become integral to the enterprise in terms of how it moves bags in an airline, how it moves how it distributes crews to different things. That can be done in the crew side, but if it goes bump in the night at 2 in the morning, who gets called? If
Mhm.
the crews aren't getting to the plane on time, right? But somebody had developed an important AI application, or however you think about it. How do you begin to think about the structures around things where for example, at a FedEx, you might have something innovative going on from the operations group, but that person leaves and
Mhm.
they're in the Cologne hub, right? And all of a sudden Cologne's down, right? We've got to start thinking about it in so many different ways and not try to stop it or contain it and think about it as shadow groups and bad things, the good things. But how do you get the good things institutionalized as they become critical to just opening the doors every day to a business? If you got a lot of citizen development, non-IT development, IT can't control that. I just don't believe we can do everything.
So first of all, I agree with, everything you said there, especially that last part. And let me say,
Mhm.
it's going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here, but first of all, I'm excited about that. I think, the era of the necessity of productivity and the era we're in, this empowers everyone.
Mhm.
I think it's incredibly opportunistic, incredibly important. Remember how we replace, fear and fatigue with, opportunity and necessity? I think
Right.
this is a really good example of it. Now, with that said, there's a saying that's been true in business and leadership forever that's still true. When everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge.
Right.
And somebody has to be in charge. And that's why I keep, believing that the CIO role's evolving. And whatever it's called, if it's a CIDO, and it has to be, somebody has to be in charge of transformation. And I'm not, usually we think about transformation, it's the most overused term for maybe the last 10 years of business. People would think, I'm modernizing something and I call it a transformation. And I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about evolutionary transformation. I'm talking about revolutionary transformation. And this is the way companies work. Who does what work? the level of domain expertise that's required in each domain. One of the things in my career at FedEx, I mean, domain expertise was power. Okay. There was a period of time that it maybe was a little bit underappreciated and thought, oh, everybody could do everything. And there was a lesson learned cycle of, well, domain expertise does matter. Okay.
Mhm.
And so I think to your question or your point you're making is yes, the expansion of capabilities across everybody is going to be the most enabling and productive and value generating thing in business, but it has to be managed. And I don't mean constrained. I mean, if it has to be something that has to be managed, everybody thought it has to be constrained or it has to be limited. No, I think it has to be managed to be almost unlimited. Okay.
Mhm.
And that's why, take it back, kind of this links back to one of the things we said very early on. We already know some of the opportunities of jobs that can, be replaced or augmented. But there's a lot of new jobs that'll get created, things we don't even know. We start talking about AI, governance, and think of like simple terms. We already know what drift and hallucination means to models.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, what we don't have is what are some form of standards and metrics and measures
Yeah.
around how you manage hallucination and drift and things like that. And then, so all forms of governance, and then you get into terms like AI ethics. It has to make decisions now. This AI has to make decisions. In some cases, I mean, autonomous vehicles, the examples given are this decision could be a life or death decision. And it's called AI ethics. We talk about that. But all of this, I think, there's a category people are talking. I was down Carnegie Mellon week before last for most of the week, and we were talking about all this stuff, but, under the category of responsible AI. So,
Mhm.
I would answer your question. I kind of set this up a long way. Is like I said, I'll talk on both sides. But one side is this is great, and the productivity and enablement it creates is incredible, but that could lead to chaos. So the other side is when everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. Somebody's in charge. I think
Mhm.
that, and I almost hate to say IT, but the digital IT transformation organization
Right.
has to be the enabler and the governance of it so that we're more productive. The worst thing, this, Charlie, anybody that did
Mhm.
systems knows you can build automation systems that leapfrog you ahead, but not having the right levels of resiliency and redundancy in those kind of systems can also tear you back down worse than you were. You can be much
Right.
more automated and productive, but if you can't keep that running all the time, you can harm customer experience greater than you ever could. When I was a young guy, we did automated package sortation systems. This is literally 1990. And somebody
Mhm.
walks into one of our hubs and he goes, I cannot believe how many packages per hour you can sort with so few people. And kind of being sarcastic, but explaining why we have the levels of resiliency and redundancy we have. I said, just remember, it can also missort just as many
Right.
packages per hour.
Right.
Well, in the AI world, okay,
Mhm.
the great things that can created are can be equally balanced with the bad things that can be created. So it
Yeah.
is super important that these new roles, these new levels of leadership and oversight and governance and responsible AI, they have to come more rapidly.
Yeah, I think that, during my career, there were more, things got introduced. If you looked at the mid-tier and then the PC and then the web and then the mobile device. And there was a lot of the same kind of conversation that went on. But, I've always felt that if the CIO is engaged and the leadership is engaged in the notion of architectural discipline. So architecture matters a lot,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not talking about technical architecture. I'm talking about business architecture and, technical and data architecture. And, if you control the architecture, right, then there are things that can go on at the edge. And if something becomes, in terms of its durability to plug into the operation, it's got to maybe go through some architectural review, plug it in, and somebody that knows how to fix it at 2 in the morning, right? When everybody's sleeping. So, it just feels this is so massive, right? That on the one hand, you don't want to contain it. On the other hand, like you said, it could do a lot of damage. right? But one thing, and I want to kind of leave this as this because I know you have very strong feelings about the data in the transaction systems, the amount of data replication that's happened over the decades has got to get cleaned up if you want to have good, pure plugins for the edge technology. They've got to plug into an architecture that has got, sources of truth as opposed to everybody's plugged into a different place because of the legacy system. So, if I were a CIO now, I would be pushing for a lot of innovation at the edge, and I would be grinding hard in a 2-year window to get the legacy data cleaned up and get a digital nervous system put in place with plugins where when it comes together, because we know you can't plug this rich analytic and agentic stuff into data that is gnarled up and have 47 definitions of what an airline arrival is, right, at a gate. So how do you think? I mean, one of the things it's kind of good not to be an operating CIO these days. On the other hand, it is really a great time to be there if you could get the funding and you believe in architecture and you've got to go clean up 30 years of legacy.
Yeah, Charlie. I mean, this is a whole topic in of itself, but it's the most exciting one to me. I mean, a lot of things we've been talking about are the things that are evolving and change management and leadership. This is about true technology. Okay, this is where I get excited. Okay, and I'll say, let me start with a really generic construct. I don't really think of AI as just AI. I think of it more than three things. Okay, way more. But generically, 60,000 foot view. Really, think of generative AI as generically creates things, and you think of agentic AI as it generically does things. Physical AI, to me, is even more powerful. It's the true revolution, and it's still coming. We generative, we really, the whole population understands it now. You know what I mean? And agentic, everybody's starting to really utilize and benefit, and at least in businesses and enterprise, just starting, and it's valuable. But we're just scratching the surface in physical AI. And in physical AI, there's a couple things, and one of the things that's a challenge, I think, is it's got a little bit of a narrow definition that I think needs to be expanded. The narrow definition is a lot of people talk about physical AI, they think of it as just, robots and autonomy and that.
Right.
I think of it far beyond it, and it connects to your data point, and that is, I think of it as the world as a live data stream. Okay. It's not just the doing physically, which is the robots and, different forms of autonomy. It's really the fact that now, there's a lot of people that say, we're in the big data era. And I always like to think, well, we've been in the big data era. That's been going on for decades. We're in the big compute era. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's very different. Okay. And in the big compute era, what we're into right now, we can see the whole world in motion. You think of everything from cameras and sensors, and a lot of people think just IoT, everything's connected. Yeah, that's one other element, but it's everything. Everything.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the connected era. The connected era plus massive amounts of the big computer era means we're starting to look at the world as a live data stream. And what does that mean? It means we can begin to optimize the world, the physical world, in real time, the real world in real time. The perfect example is like you almost never hear me say digital twins because I'm like, almost feel like digital twins is an old construct because most people think of digital twins as I need to create this static version of the real world. I need to create this separate world that's not the real world, okay? A twin of it so that we can do things with it. And, I mean, obviously we did a lot of that, right? But in today's capabilities, you don't need the twin. You can
Mm-hmm.
optimize the original
Mm-hmm.
because you can see it happening at once. The one, world's AI company, they're headquartered in Dallas, Texas. Charlie, where you're from. They're an unbelievable company. I'm on the board of directors there. And they're a physical AI company. Doesn't mean they're building robots. It means that they have the AI capabilities that look and consume this level of information, not just create intelligence of it that a human can make decisions, but that humans can create models and algorithms that make unbelievable things that humans can't do happen, including optimizing things.
Right.
That's the physical world. Now, okay, why did I go through all that to answer your question is yes, I mean, in the traditional sense, many enterprises have, massive amounts of data that necessarily, we thought of this as a system of insight and this was a system of record. Never shall the two cross. I mean, one might feed the other, whatever, but they're two separate things, and it was super important mainly for processing capabilities and the intelligence off of them to keep them separate. And that's another thing that's changing is, and so my I think yes, the whole idea of you know data intelligence from all the way from data labeling and knowledge of building intelligent data that can be integrated was super important. I mean, Scale AI is a company that last I looked at evaluation of $13.9 billion, and that was
Mhm.
created by Alex Wang, brilliant young 19-year-old who left MIT and created it. And it was about to be a data labeling company. He was just way ahead of his time because he knew that we were the era that companies don't understand, especially enterprises, don't understand their data, and they needed to. And that's true. But I also, my thinking on this is evolving also to say yes and. Yes, and
Mhm.
sometimes you're not going to have to go back and clean that all up and fix it
Mhm.
because in today's era, you can look at what's really happening in real time, turn
Mhm.
it into a live data stream, and absolutely change what's possible in your company.
Mhm.
It sounds like, rocket science, but the reality of it is today, it's very doable today. That stuff is the capabilities are there, and we've already lit up everything in operations. There's cameras everywhere, there's sensors everywhere, there's intelligent devices everywhere, and we
Mhm.
can consume and process that. So I do think it's the answer is to your ultimate setup there is, and this I'm gonna sound like a consultant now. It's an it depends answer. It
Mhm.
depends whether you're trying to be who you already are and you just want to create the higher levels of intelligence and utilizing AI over what you already have. Or are you trying to, be truly transformational and say we can do different or more? And in that
Right.
case, you may not have to go back and clean up the mess of the past. You may just be able to go forward. And to me,
Yeah.
that excites me to no end. I'm spending so much time in that space
Mhm.
because I think of how much cleanup and FedEx was huge and we were also 50 years old, right? We had modern things and we had old things. I think about
Mhm.
that, everybody always didn't appreciate, retiring mainframes and stuff. They thought, oh, that's messy. No kidding, it's messy. There's no other way to get rid of it. You know what I mean?
Right.
The only people that didn't realize it was messy are those who didn't have to do it. But
Mhm.
but we're entering an era that there'll be less having to go back and you'll be able to go forward a lot more. So
Yeah,
sorry,
but
long answer, but I
no,
this
no,
space
no.
is incredibly powerful, incredibly opportunistic, and one of the most exciting things about you may not have to clean up the past like we did like we always had to.
Mhm. Well, I think that, just to be a little bit controversial, being able to get from where you are to the future, you've got to breathe, you've got to live, right,
Yep.
long enough. But I'm very encouraged by the AI tools. We had a session with Nitin, a podcast from Emphasis, the tools to go in and get the business rules and get the, extract stuff from the legacy. That's why I'm saying, a couple of years, not a 10-year journey, because using AI to go in and understand the current systems and how you would bridge yourself from the past to the current, not transform everything, but bridge yourself so you could live every minute of every day. Getting from here to there is becoming very possible, but you got to get the funding to do it. You got to get the executive committee to understand and the CFO to understand the stuff that we're talking about here because it's not going to happen without investment, right?
Yeah, and I
And
agree, Charlie. That is especially in the consulting space, that the tools today are incredible.
mhm.
It's another example where I think domain expertise is going to matter even more. The tools get insight and intelligence, especially around the things you mentioned earlier. You talked a lot about normalization and redundancy and those things. And, that was like, street corner warfare in the past. And
Mhm.
now you can go at it in mass scale with these tools. So yeah, I think, I didn't concentrate on that as much in the answer, but I agree with you completely. And that's enabling for a lot of enterprises today because it was too hard to do before. And if you're in that space, it's much more possible to do it at a much more rapid rate and create intelligence out of the data that before, if you really weren't, responsible in your data environment in the past, it was just too hard to go back and catch it up. Now you can.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm very excited about the future. And people, ask me why I haven't retired at this point. I'm very excited to get up every day and look at what the possibilities are, right? And get from the truly industrial era, which the last 50 years of the industrial era was the IT era. And
Mhm.
now we're moving to a new era, but the time compression, there'll be a lot more Sears and Kodaks and companies that just are missing the opportunity because they're just thinking in the old paradigm of G&A and overhead expense and IT, and we've got to break the back of that. And I think that's, it's that I question whether companies can get there in a public world and not have to go private for a few years to make the leap because it's not going to be a typical transformation. It's going to be a leap
Mhm.
kind of transformation. Is not 15 years to work this out, right? And it's a
True.
very exciting time, but it's also good to be in a position like you are, where you've spent so much of your time in the detail, millions of transactions. I mean, not big scale stuff with complexity and globalness to it, and acquisition. So you've lived the dream, but now you can kind of step above it a little bit, still knowing the DNA from 35 years of being at the coalface of this thing. And now you're looking at the world. So this has been a very valuable, conversation. And I'd love to, maybe we can do a community call where people could actually ask you questions.
Love to do it. And
And
anything with Charlie's community, I'm always up for it. That's easy.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, it's great, Ken. I really appreciate the time you're spending on this, and just our interaction, just not in a podcast, but just the stuff we talk about from time to time. And like I said, over the years, we haven't always agreed on everything, but we've pushed each other.
yeah, that's part of it. We all get better together, and it's the same. I
Yeah.
always say, I guess I've gotten to a stage of my life that I have great gratitude. I have gratitude for the fact that 20 years ago we were building systems and working in an environment that we did billions of transactions, in fact, hundreds of billions of transactions decades ago. So it's really relevant when you think of the compute era and stuff today. So I'm appreciative of the career that I was so blessed to have, but all the people I've been around. Talk about culture. I mean, Rob Carter is one of the great cultural leaders I ever met, and he's just a great man. And when we talk about gratitude, today I look back and I appreciate all the things that I got to do and learn and who from, but then I apply it going forward. My wife
Mhm.
often says, you're the worst retired guy I've ever seen. You're so busy. And what I realize is, I'm starting to feel like Charlie. I love what I'm doing. I love being, quote, retired. I get to do what I want and where it makes sense, and I get to add value in places. And I love to have more time to spend with, Carnegie Mellon and some of these other enterprises. It's so enabling and empowering. But it's amazing how much of what I had in the past, it's directly relevant. And I think people that are in IT, that happens. That's really true.
Yeah.
And you one of the Charlie, I'll say it all along, it's in, I think, The Blind Spot. You wrote what, 15, 18 years ago. And pattern recognition
Mhm.
matters now more than ever. And
Right.
I was blessed in my career because early in my, no, fairly early in my career was the internet era. and it really changed everything. What was possible? It was, everybody talks about technology is revolutionary and this and that, but that was the one big massive revolution, and there was a bunch of micro ones after it. But I think AI is the next revolution. I mean,
Yeah.
we're already in it, but truly, as much as the internet was revolutionary to the entire world and how we live and work, AI is just as revolutionary, probably more than the way we live and work. And all the things we're talking about today, your point about companies have to change. Yeah, I mean, everything moves faster, and those who fail will move faster, and those who succeed and reinvent themselves will move faster. So it's super
Yeah.
important to have thoughtful people. I think a board of directors, and they're so important in enterprises. We always at FedEx had world-class board of directors, and I loved getting to interface with them all the time and stuff. But it's one of the things I've been thinking about so much lately is how are those going to evolve? You know,
Hmm.
and I think even there, I mean, that's at the highest level. You think, oh, even that has to evolve. So I
Hmm.
think this is truly, to your words, the most exciting time in a while.
Yeah.
And I think we're just at the infancy of it, which makes it really exciting.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ken, and we'll continue the dialogue. And like I said, this is kind of a static podcast, but I'd love to get in an environment with maybe two or three other folks and really have a discussion with the community of CIOs and chief architects and development leaders that we've touched over the institute years over the last 15 years. So I look forward to it, and we'll see you in February. So we
Yep, I
can,
will see you in Naples, Florida in February. So,
yeah.
Charlie, always great. Thank you for having me. It's an honor. And glad to participate in anything going forward.
Well, thanks so much, Ken. I appreciate it.
This conversation reinforces something we talk about with the Feld Group Institute often. Transformation isn't about tools. It's about systems, people, and leadership. AI may be accelerating change, but the real work is still human. Building adaptability, creating clarity, and architecting organizations that can move. Ken, thank you for sharing your perspective and experience. And as always, thanks to everyone for taking a walk with us.